Hey folks, and welcome to iWizard. So today I'm going to be talking about a forgotten classic. This is the epic historical fiction novel Aztec by Gary Jennings. I really did not know what to expect when I picked this one up, but I have a lot of thoughts. Let's talk about it. All right, welcome back. Jordan here. So again, this is 1980s Aztec, and this is book one in a larger series, with the sequels being Aztec Autumn, followed by Aztec Blood, Aztec Rage, Aztec Fire, and Aztec Revenge. Gary Jennings only wrote the first two. The last four were written by other authors, and I've been told they're not as good, but I haven't read them, so I wouldn't be able to say anything about that. But let's get into a synopsis of this one. Aztec is the extraordinary story of the last and greatest native civilization of North America. Told in the words of one of the most robust and memorable characters in modern fiction, Mixedly Darkcloud, Aztec reveals the very depths of Aztec civilization, from the peak and feather banner splendor of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan to the arrival of Hernan Cortez and his conquistadors and their destruction of the Aztec Empire. The story starts in 1529 with a letter from King Carlos of Spain to Juan de Zumarraga, the bishop of the See of New Spain, and his missionary friars. The king wants information about the indigenous population he's just conquered and everything there is to know about their culture, their history, traditions, style of government, customs. So the bishop employs Mixedly Darkcloud, an elderly Mexica man who it turns out is our main character, to tell his story, to narrate his biography so that the monks of Mexico City can send it back to Spain. So Mixedly sits down and takes the monks back to 1466 and tells his whole life story, which begins on the island of Xaltocan, where he describes his upbringing, the traditions, politics, and practices of this mysterious culture. At this time, Aztec civilization was divided between three city-states in the Valley of Mexico. And that lasted until the conquistadors and their native allies under the command of Cortez defeated them in 1521. Anyways, the book starts out describing Mixedly's childhood with his sister. We get a wonderful scene at the beginning where he accompanies his father, a stonemason, to Tenochtitlan. We get Mixedly's early friendships and sexual encounters, his coming of age and training when he's selected to work in the palace of Nezahualpilli as a scribe. We experience the drama and intrigue and debauchery and conspiracies of court life. We get to see the construction of the Great Pyramid and Mixedly's exploits in the Flowery War. We follow his life and travels in his 20s as a merchant, and later his marriage and the birth of his children. For all his triumphs and tribulations and travels, his rise to nobility, the crowning of Moctezuma, his loves and losses, all the way up to the arrival of the Spaniards and their destruction of Tenochtitlan, throughout it all we're on the journey with Mixedly, and Jennings spares no details as he weaves this epic tale of heroic dignity and a colossal civilization's rise and fall. Alright, so just a non-spoiler summary there. This bad boy is 800 pages, so I thought I'd give you a more robust synopsis there and do it justice. So I'll start by saying that I just loved the sheer level of care and detail that was invested here. Similar to someone like James Michener, Jennings was known for the intensive breadth and depth of the research he put into his books. Apparently, to write Aztec, he lived in Mexico for 12 years and claims to have learned Nahuatl, which is the Aztec language, and how to interpret pictographs and codices so he could get all the details just right here. Precisely how historically accurate this book is, I couldn't really say. I'm certainly no expert on Mesoamerican history. Some people have said that Jennings gets it mostly right. I saw a review by a PhD student whose specialty is in this area, and he said that the book takes a certain authorial license in a lot of places, but that it's mostly accurate. Either way, you can tell that so so much research and care was put into the presentation of Aztec culture, just the sights and smells and sensations of the time, the way the architecture and the land and the customs are described, how they lived, how the Aztec worshipped, norms surrounding sexual morality and child rearing and the roles of the sexes, just everything that a student of history could ever want to know. We get lessons on Aztec art and hunting and economics, but all of this is happening really as the plot is moving forward. There are really no info dumps here. Everything is seamlessly weaved into the story, which is very gripping and entertaining. For example, there's a scene that is extremely important for the main character, and during that scene, we're also kind of getting a lesson on how the Aztec men broke and hauled limestone. And you don't even really realize that you're getting a lesson here from Jennings because he still keeps the plot interesting, and that's kind of happening in the background. So I really thought Jennings just brought Aztec society to life. Another thing is the structure of the book. As I mentioned, the narrative is being transmitted by Mixtli as he's sharing his life story with these monks, with these friars who are copying it all down at the behest of King Carlos of Spain. And obviously, a man's life story is quite a long thing to tell. So each chapter reflects a period of this guy's life, and it's told like a classic coming-of-age story. And so Juan, who is the main bishop down there, he's sending chapters one by one to the king as a bundle of papers. And what's cool is that in between each chapter, you get a letter from Juan being like, Your Majesty, what you're about to read, what I'm about to send you in this chapter is very unchristian and extremely offensive. This ungodly pagan's life story grows more and more degenerate and detestable by the day. So I am so sorry you have to read this, but we're just following your orders. We're sorry in advance. And there are even letters from the bishop basically urging King Carlos to put a stop to their duties of having to copy out this story because of how base and disgusting they feel Mixtli's life is. And so we get like a preview of whatever exciting drama is going to take place in the next chapter. And Jennings also uses this as a device to capture the attitudes of European Christians, to put things in a more worldly and historical context. The friars in this are hilarious. They are like pearl-clutching school marms. So it's actually really funny at times to experience not only their horror at Mixtli's story, but also their melodramatic outrage when the king gets back to them and says that he's actually enjoying Mixtli's story and that he's completely wrapped in it. And the king is also like, by the way, Mixtli said there's some plant that people use as a contraceptive. How can we get some of that? Right? So I don't know. It's just really funny and also a very effective device that the story is being told this way with this semi-epistolary, I guess you could call it, sort of frame narrative device. And speaking of that, I have to say, for all of my big-time fantasy lovers out there, I know this gets booked as just plain old historical fiction. And when you go to Barnes & Noble, sometimes it's put in the fantasy section, sometimes it's put in the regular fiction section. But I'm telling you, this thing definitely reads more than anything like an epic fantasy novel, like a modern coming-of-age fantasy novel with classic elements. I told my wife when I was reading this that in terms of the story itself and what it kind of felt like while I was reading it, this book is like if you put Name of the Wind by Pat Rothfuss, Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, and James Cameron's Avatar into a blender and just aesthetically maybe add in a dash of Mel Gibson's Apocalypto. If you put all of those influences into a blender, this book is pretty much what you'd get. There's like a warrior school and a manners school. There are rites of passage and trials and war games and public duels and feuds with rival suitors. There's battle and warrior training. There's a belief in magic and that magical forces are at work in the world. And so even if you don't actually get to see the magic being done, even if there's no quote-unquote magic system in this book, it's at least something that everyone in the story believes is a real force that works in the world. Also, as I said, there's a bit of a Great Expectations vibe going on here, in the sense that what this story is about is an ordinary boy who gets plucked out of obscurity and chosen to become something great and to make something of himself in the big city, which for Aztecs, Tenochtitlan felt like the center of the world, obviously. But there's just so much adventure here. This book is sprawling. Eventually, Mixley goes to war. He captures prisoners and becomes a merchant. We get to venture into Maya lands. There's run-ins with bandits. All of that great adventure stuff that we like. And so I want to tell my buddies in the world of fantasy on Discord and all of that, you have to read this book because it really does feel like you're reading fantasy. And it's cool too because the main character, Mixley, is myopic. He's nearsighted. So it's fascinating to be getting this narrative not from one of the Aztec soldiers or hunters or ordinary workers or even from a member of the nobility, but from a boy who has a visual impairment, someone who has a limitation placed on him. And so here he is having to survive at the height of Aztec civilization. And because he's nearsighted, this actually enables him to be a good scribe because he can just keep his eyes close to the parchment. And so there may even be some symbolism there with his quote unquote nearsightedness. So you'll have to read and find out if there's a deeper meaning there in terms of a person being nearsighted and not seeing what's coming. And speaking again of deeper meanings, there are some great life lessons in this book. Yes, the story's about a particular place and time, but there are also universal messages that I think really anyone can relate to. The wisdom the elders impart, life lessons that Mixley learns through experience. And one of the main lessons in this book is the idea that it's not about mere living. It's about living rightly and courageously. That's the thing that counts, which is very Socrates. There's also this idea that I think we need to hear now more than ever, probably, which is don't run around this world fearing death constantly. And I think that's a much more well-adjusted and healthy way to live. The elites and rulers in this society had a kind of memento mori concept and sort of life outlook that reminded me very much of the Romans, where these Aztecs would hold up a skull and remind themselves that they're mere mortals and to avoid hubris and arrogance. One of the mantras of this culture, in fact, is that, quote, death is merely waking up from the dream of having lived. And there is some really cool comparative religious stuff going on here. One example I remember is when King Carlos writes to the Bishop of Mexico that he believes the Aztec creator god Quetzalcoatl is actually the Apostle Thomas. And there's a lot of stuff like this where there's speculation from both the Christians and the Aztec. But in terms of the Aztec themselves, one thing that resonated with me is how truly sophisticated they actually were. The Aztecs had a currency and treasury. They paid what would be the equivalent of national and state taxes, essentially. They engaged in trade and export. They had a sophisticated and interesting class system, subsidies for housing, obviously slaves too. They had huge cities lit up with all different colors and flags made of bird feathers with pyramids and zoos and inns for tourists, speaking of that fantasy element. They had rudimentary but actually effective plumbing and waste management, buildings with many stories and rooftop gardens and all of that kind of modern stuff. They had public parks and law enforcement and land management and sports, actually. Yes, they played sports with padding so that the players didn't get injured. The Aztec had a very sophisticated language and script. Poets and philosophers, and they could predict eclipses, and so they had a little bit of science. And this was just a little surprising to me because it's not really the version of the Aztecs I had previously been taught in school. And what's interesting is that even some of the aspects of Aztec culture that get all the press and that modern people like to talk about, and here I'm obviously talking about the human sacrifices, the reason that Aztec people did human sacrifice and Obviously, human sacrifice is deeply evil, but one of the reasons behind it had to do with certain deeply held religious beliefs. For example, that the sun nourishes and gives life to the people, and so the people in return have to feed the sun for all of his labors, or else the sun won't continue to shine on the people, which would be devastating. But I really had no idea that the human sacrifices had anything to do with the sun, or in this case, the sun god Huitzilopochtli, I think. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. And so along with that, another thing that I appreciated was that the author didn't shy away from being honest about some of the more brutal and I guess you could say barbaric practices that the Aztec engaged in. So if you're someone who is particularly squeamish, or if you're someone who's kind of easily traumatized, probably don't read this book. In this book, there is incest, there is cannibalism and cannibalism of enemies, keeping your enemies' body parts as mementos. There are male ejaculation contests and prostitution and rape of slaves, flutes made of human shin bones and thigh bones used as drumsticks in human sacrifice rituals. And let me tell you, there is a lot of cannibalism in this book. Even the main character engages in cannibalism on more than one occasion. Actually, the sacrifices and the utter gore involved reminded me at one point of the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, but definitely worse. The blood flowing down the stone of sacrifice, the blood and excrement covered executioners who were cleaning up the scene, the meat cutters who would chop the cadavers up and hack off the thighs and feed them to the animals and slaves, and they would boil the heads down really fast so they could preserve the skulls and stack them up and build stuff out of them and display them. The bodies would often be preserved as fertilizer so that you could farm better. So that brings us to what I disliked about this book. And there are a few things, though I wouldn't say it's overwhelming or anything like that, but there were a couple of things that kind of got to me a little bit. At times, the weird sex stuff became a bit gratuitous. And I swear I'm no prude, but it's like well beyond Game of Thrones, and I'm referring to the TV show. When Mixley is giving lengthy discourses about his theories about sex, how he believes that the larger the nipples, the more horny the woman will prove to be. That sort of thing, just the digressions, it's a bit over the top. The fact that we have a princess in this story, Jade Stone Doll, who has sex with a dead man and an 11-year-old, just the relentless incest and the lesbian sex scenes, and the fact that the book rises to well beyond the level, definitely, of softcore pornography on many occasions. It's just a bit much. How every woman with whom Mixley is intimate worships his member, or the author's seemingly compulsive need to describe the look and feel of every woman's tipili, as they're called. That's the Nahuatl word. Just the fact that all of the women in Mixley's orbit are like stunning beauties of unbelievable grace who just drench Mixley in their unconditional love. So anyways, I felt it was a little over the top. It was a minor thing. I mean, the story is great, but it really is kind of like the show Game of Thrones, where you've got these very normal things happening, and then just in the background, or I don't know, all of a sudden, they're just going at it and stripping down and doing weird sex stuff. And it got to the point where it actually felt kind of juvenile. It almost felt like the author was trying to play out, I don't know, his fantasies or something like that. And I would say too, and again, I hate to always be the one doing this because I love chonky books, but this book definitely could have been shortened by about 120 pages. That would be a conservative estimate there on that one. And I say that mainly because the book, as wonderful as it really is and as readable as it is, it does get sluggish around halfway through, and it stays a slog for probably 120 pages, maybe 150 pages, as I said before. There were just too many mundane scenes that were included there in the middle with seemingly no larger purpose to them. But other than that, I have to say, I almost want to say it's a forgotten classic, and I really do think it deserves a revival. I think part of the problem might be that there's no official audiobook, or at least not one that I could find on Audible. There's an amateur audiobook version on YouTube that some guy reads that is very good. But again, you won't find this on Audible. And if you're going to listen to the audiobook on YouTube, it's going to eat up your data if you're commuting or something like that. So, but the sequel, weirdly enough, the sequel, Aztec Autumn, is actually on Audible, just not the most famous and popular and widely read one. So I would love it if Amazon would get around to doing that. But that may be one of the things that's preventing it from being considered as one of today's sort of beloved top tier books. I don't know. It may be the way that the author describes women, or the incest, or the rape, or whatever. That may be it too. But all right, so I'm going to stop there. Please follow us on Goodreads, on Instagram, on Facebook. Feel free to tip your starving booktuber on Patreon. And until next time, happy reading.